Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Kate Evarts, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I also work at the clinical psychology doctoral program on the New England campus, where I'm director of student affairs, core faculty, and director of the Center for Diversity and Social Justice, which is how I met Cynthia at our Collaborative for Racial Justice, Reconciliation, and Healing. And Cynthia asked me to speak today from a little bit of the white ally position. And I want to mention that it isn't just for my peer white allies and non-Latin allies, but for all of us. These are helpful topics too. So I'm going to start with developing our co-conspiratorship. Just thinking about how we can all move towards more of a co-conspirator rather than ally position. I imagine we're all allies being here today if you are not here for other reasons. So how can we keep moving that development further? And again, that's very much a call in to my white peers, but really it's for all of us as well in all the very forms of co-conspiratorship. That will frame us to then go into talking about navigating racial and difficult dialogues and just some do's and don'ts, again, for all of us. And then moving on to repairing unintentional harm in presentations. I want to mention that that is coming in large part from some of the content I've done with some of my peers in the Student Success Symposia. So some of you who are here will see a slide or two from that as well. And then we'll end with a thought exercise. If there's time for us to have more of a discussion, that'll be lovely. And if not, then you can take those questions with you. At any point, by the way, since this is meeting format, please feel free to unmute and ask a question, to correct me, to just share a thought you're having. I really very much am open to any interaction that you would like to provide. I can tell you I can't look at the chat at the same time because it's a little overwhelming to do both, but please feel free to unmute. And to my team, if you see something in the chat that would be helpful for me to know, please do unmute and let me know. So again, as I mentioned, we're starting with developing co-conspiratorship. And so there are these three levels, and I'm going to talk about those in this first slide after this lovely quote from Carmen de Monteflores. And this is, oppression can only survive through silence. And so I wanted this as our first quote. This is a native Puerto Rican writer. I wanted it to be a call in for all of us that using our voices is one way that we can help to sort of combat this oppression that really does affect all of us. I want to mention also there are times where silence is also powerful. And so it is not to, belie that. That definitely is true as well. But coming forward as co-conspirators, using our voice when and where we're able is an important skill and talent and resource. So as I mentioned, three sort of levels. Allies, as we all, at least I would say, can call ourselves here, is this sort of work towards racial and social justice with an awareness of the power and privilege associated with belonging to those dominant groups. But it is more sort of the showing up when convenient piece, and you'll see that at the bottom here. Accomplices, on the other hand, take the next step towards advocacy, speaking up, speaking with folks in the marginalized group with whom they are accomplices with. So it's attempting to challenge those systems with their privilege at the risk of their own comfort. So you can see that's like a little bit more of a risk taking than allyship. Then going that last level of co-conspiratorship is taking that step further towards activism. And so we're really helping to plan, develop, and implement new systems. So where co-conspirators are not just showing up where it's convenient, like allies, or when there's risk like accomplices, they're actually going proactively into the risk by helping to plan next steps. You can see also a distinction here is challenging existing systems versus building new ones. So how can we all move towards our co-conspiratorship? One is educating ourselves, including on ourselves. You're going to notice there are some asterisks here, and those are to say we're going to come back to these topics in future slides. So we'll talk a little bit more about educating ourselves, including on ourselves, as well as owning our privilege and power. See something, say something, regardless of who is in the room. And an important point of this, which I'll come back to as well, is saying that it bothers you. So not necessarily speaking for people in the room who might be in the group that's being targeted, but saying that it bothers you as the person who's speaking up. And then building a community of co-conspirators, as we have been doing through this very exciting conference here. Rather than simply listening and learning, taking active steps to get involved. So this includes practicing difficult dialogues, meeting with people whose feedback you trust and whom we trust to tell us if something is landing wrong or if our implicit biases are poking through in what we're saying. This activity and active step is really important. So like I think out of BLM, this I'm listening and learning sort of phrase came up among allies, and it's passive. So let's challenge ourselves to go further than listening and learning. And then accepting feedback non-defensively, very important and very challenging. And that's part of why practicing is so important, because of course our brains are going to get in there and try to defend our ego and so forth. So it takes a lot of practice and a lot of knowing yourself to be able to respond to feedback non-defensively. Once you've done all of these 6 steps, and these are in stepwise order, I would say obviously you can sort of like jump back and forth among them, but at least by the time you hit 7, please have done 1 through 6. Because if you're making yourself a confidant to those who belong to the marginalized group that's being targeted in a given setting, then you also need to be able to show that you can identify and intervene around microaggressions, that you can provide empathy while still knowing that you can't fully know that person's experience, be able to talk about white supremacy, patriarchy, the systems that are in place, in large part to avoid falling into micro invalidations. And micro invalidations are when someone tells somebody who's experienced a microaggression that, oh, that's just you're being sensitive. It's not a microaggression. So obviously you can see that's one of the most pernicious and gaslighting forms of microaggression. So to avoid that, then obviously steps 1 through 6 really need to have been completed. And then lastly, using our power with rather than power over those in marginalized groups to create new systems, policies, and so forth. Okay. Gosh, it's hard to see my text here. Move this guy. So this is an Audre Lorde quote that you very well may have heard before, and it's a very important piece in terms of the differences amongst us are not the problem. The problem is that we arbitrarily have stratified ourselves across those differences. So as Audre Lorde says, certainly there are very real differences between us and among us of race, age, and sex, but it is not those differences between us that are separating us. It's rather our refusal to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them. So the refusal to recognize is really that like colorblind phase that our country and many have gone through. So obviously recognizing that there are differences, not just saying I don't see race or I don't see ethnicity, recognizing is an important first step, but then also examining the distortions that have occurred because we've decided, and by we, I mean like our historical founding folks have decided that there's these reasons that people should be able to own land or be in relationships or whatever it might be, and that very arbitrary decision making around a hierarchy lasts through today with very real impacts. So our white supremacist patriarchal society built on exceptionalism, this idea that some people are just better or more superior, has led to an arbitrary stratification of people according to race, ethnicity, and other identities, with dominant groups being misnamed, and that's the misnaming part here with Audre Lorde, as superior or better in some way. And that is not at all true. Okay, so that kind of gears us up to then talk about our positionality. So positionality, as I define it, is the intersection between your demographic factors, which are these friends over here, your demographic factors, and the intersection of that with our hierarchy in the society in which you either grew up or are currently living. So what are those power structures? Again, arbitrary, but what are those power structures in the society in which you are in? And how do your demographic factors relate to those? So this is on the right, the Pamela Hayes model. And Pamela Hayes done amazing work. It's called the addressing model. This is an extension of it to include other categories that she did not include. So trauma, for example, is an addition. So it no longer actually fits the model of like the acronym addressing, which is why it's called the addressing model. You can see on the profile at the bottom, it's addressing. So it's not really a addressing model anymore. But the point is, these demographic factors are some of the ones that we happen to have this sort of arbitrary hierarchy around. The reason I include the wheel on the left is because there are some gray areas, and that's sort of one of the critiques of the Hayes model that I think is really important, which is that Hayes says, are you agent or are you target? So agent are folks who have power, and target are those who are marginalized. That's pretty dichotomous. And so this wheel on the left, the ideal here of the wheel, is that there is actually some gray area. So where heterosexual folks have the most power, gay men also have more power than lesbian, bi, pan, and asexual folks, amongst the many other forms of marginalized gender and sexual identities. So, right, like middle class is different from rich or poor, or those with wealth and those without. And then you might see also here the gender piece, that cisgender women have more power than trans, intersex, non-binary folks, but less power than cis men. So I bring that up. One way that I think about that with myself, for example, is I have extremely poor eyesight. I'm nearsighted, so I have to wear glasses to go anywhere, do anything that doesn't involve a screen this close to my face. So, but I'm mobile and I have a lot of able-bodied parts to myself. So I really don't identify as disabled. And I would say that I'm sort of like in a more gray zone, much more towards able-bodied, however. As a queer woman, I also fall under that sort of same thing where although I'm queer, I don't have the intersection also of being trans or gender non-binary. And so you can also think about intersections of identities as well, where falling under multiple marginalized groups leads to an amplification of oppression and marginalization. Okay. I bring this up because you've all heard this. This is like when the fish turns to the other fish and says, "What do you mean water?" Wait, it's in the air. The implicit bias that comes from our positionality, which is why I bring up our positionality, is all around us. So much so that if you're not like really on an ongoing basis identifying and challenging those implicit biases, they'll come out sort of sideways or come out in different ways that you're not expecting or that you don't even see. So our positionalities inform our implicit biases in ways that are even more invisible to us if we belong to a dominant group. So my whiteness in particular leads to much stronger implicit biases that I'm less aware of than, for example, my queerness. My queerness doesn't, just because I'm queer doesn't mean I don't have other blind spots associated with sexual identity, but I'm more aware of those and sort of my internalized implicit bias than I am of the implicit biases associated with being in a dominant group. So co-conspirators, like those of us today that are working towards co-conspiratorship, we know that self-reflection and activism are never done. We're not in a post-feminism world. We're not in a post-racism world. We're not in a post-Me Too world. This is a long journey that is going to be going on for all of our lifetimes, for sure. And so anyone who sort of says like, right, I've done this content, even the content I'm sharing today, that's not really doing the work because the work is never done. And so we're always going to be thinking about, okay, so last time I heard about the Hayes model or the addressing model, here's what I was thinking about. What are you thinking about today? What are the experiences you've had since the last time you heard about the addressing model? What have those led to in terms of how you're integrating some of the knowledge from today now? I think this also matches with this idea that we don't have a static self and that we're constantly growing as well. So same thing here with implicit bias. We're constantly sort of assessing how our implicit biases are shifting. So we're constantly assessing how our privileged identities inform our implicit biases against marginalized groups that we don't belong to, how our marginalized identities inform our internalized implicit biases against our own group, and then also how white supremacy, patriarchy, exceptionalism have conditioned implicit biases among marginalized groups. And so this idea of sort of fighting for reduced resources as sort of like this myth put forth by white supremacy. So Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz said, "I don't study to learn more, but to ignore less." I want to say something about the idea of ignorance, right, which is just at its baseline means a lack of knowledge. But ignorance, if you think about it as ignoring, is a little bit more of an active quality, right? Like you're making a choice to ignore a certain group, cultural group, a person, a neighbor, whatever it might be. And so the idea with this sort of educating yourself about including yourself and your implicit biases is to ignore less or sort of more actively take the position of trying to learn more and to therefore ignore less. Okay, that's that first chunk there. I'm noticing also the chat has like 9, so I'm hoping that that's, and now 10. I hope someone's going to tell me if that's related to me. Okay, so I also want to remind everyone too, I'm going to be talking about navigating racial and difficult dialogues, and this is not as a way of like appeasing the white folks in racial dialogues. This is actually even more so a call out to white folks in racial dialogues to be doing these things. So I want to be really clear that that's the distinction I'm making. That said, we all can learn from this as well, including what to share with your white allies or non-Latin allies about what they could be doing better in these dialogues. I'm going to first talk about some effective and ineffective strategies to do with these dialogues, and then I'm also going to talk about what happens if microaggressions occur in a dialogue. So some ineffective strategies. You can see on the right here, I'm talking about Dr. Daryl Wing Su's work, and you can find this book very useful. These are the ineffective strategies. The following slide are the more effective ones. So some ineffective strategies, doing nothing. So if you are the instructor, let's say, of a racial dialogue, you're in a class, you're teaching a class, and it turns to the topic of race. A common instinct is to just shut up and remove yourself. but you're actually sort of teaching those in the room about passivity, right? And so like actually being more active as the instructor in that dialogue is pretty important. Similarly, one might have the instinct to sidetrack the conversation to something you know more about. So say you're a white leader or a non-Latin leader of a racial dialogue, your instinct might be to say, well, as a woman, I have this experience. And what, just as ideally, you're trying to just say that that's one thing you can relate to or you know more about. But unfortunately, it has the unintended impact of sidetracking the conversation away from racial dialogue, which is also an ineffective strategy. Another thing you might have the instinct to do is to sort of appease the participants. Racial dialogue is emotional. There is an emotional quality to it. It's activating. And for those with racial trauma in particular, it might be activating to the point of a traumatic reaction, whether that's hypoactivation or hyperactivation, or and even leaving the room or sort of doing what they can to protect themselves, which is absolutely welcomed. So you might then have the instinct, okay, well, then I really need to like shut this down or remove the emotional quality to it. When in fact, actually, that's not helpful because there's a reason it's emotional. And actually, that's an important part of learning. So appeasing and sort of reducing the impact or maintaining harmony, for example, can actually negate the deeper exploration that should be happening. Terminating the discussion, sort of ending it, obviously, you might be thinking, well, people are getting upset. Someone just left the room. Maybe I should just stop this conversation or table it and not even carry through with it. Right. There's probably a scenario in which it might make sense to table it, but then you should actually come back to it as well, not just table it and leave it out in the ether. So the idea there is to continue it. Maybe it means taking some deep breaths together if there's some intense activation or conflict, but continuing the conversation nonetheless. And then the last sort of ineffective strategy is to become defensive. So oftentimes, especially those who feel activated or discredited themselves in terms of white fragility, might then also challenge the credibility of the person running the discussion, regardless of their race. They're in the power position because they're running the discussion. So that might lead to discrediting the person running it. And then that person might then feel defensive and feel the need to sort of be like, well, I'm not racist, or I have a Black friend, or, whatever that might look like, which is obviously, I don't need to explain to you why that's harmful. It models defensiveness, one thing, right? You're modeling it for the other people in the room that it's okay to sort of be like, no, that's not what happened, or whatever it might be. So there are some obvious dangers with that. I'm also going to come back to some ways to non-defensively respond to feedback. So sort of put an asterisk to that one as well. Okay, some 5 effective strategies on the reverse. So the first that Dr. Sue talks about is understanding your own racial and cultural identity. And certainly that's something I was raising sort of as a piece of your positionality in the first portion. We need to know our own positionality in forms of privilege and marginalization in order to know what our implicit biases might be doing without our will, without our conscious will. And so, for example, if I know more about my racial identity and how it might show up as implicit biases, I'm better able to acknowledge that implicit bias might be coming into the room when I do a certain thing or say a certain thing. So that relates to the second point here, where because I'm aware of that, my whiteness is definitely going to have implicit biases and blind spots that come with it. I can acknowledge or admit my racial biases with more ease. And one of my colleagues consulted with Dr. Sue many years ago now, and my colleague's white. And Dr. Sue said to him, "Okay, so they're talking about this case, right? They're talking about the case, and then Dr. Sue turns to him and says, "Okay, so now what about your racism?" Right. So this is years ago too, but we ideally, and I think people push back against this now, but I think there's less pushback against it. But there's this idea that all of us were conditioned in a racist society. So the idea that we don't have any implicit biases or any racism in our automatic thoughts and implicit biases is pretty naive. And how could we not, right? Like just thinking about TV when we were all being raised, it was egregious. So TV, media, family, friends, schools, our history books, racism is everywhere. And so the idea that we don't have implicit biases is not helpful to then being able to acknowledge them when they come up, because they will. Then you might validate and facilitate discussion of feelings. So people are bringing in emotional content and being able to say like, wow, that feels really important. And I can really feel your anger, sadness, grief, whatever it might be. And further facilitating, saying like, so share more about what you're feeling right now, or share more about how that affects your emotion. Controlling the process, but not the content of race talk is important. So it might mean slowing down, sort of inviting everyone to speak, for example, the sort of idea that silence is violence in a racial dialogue as well. So the idea if there are folks that are, particularly those in the privileged groups that are not speaking, you might invite them to speak as a part of the process and sort of go around. And then when people do speak, especially when it feels unsafe to do so, definitely validating and encouraging and expressing admiration and appreciation when they do. Certainly, if you're in the power down position as someone who's not leading the discussion, it can feel very unsafe. And including for folks with white fragility, where it feels like you're going to put your foot in your mouth. And so you decide not to say anything. If you do say something, even if it's a mistake, that's an opportunity for learning. And so if the instructor is able to say, like, okay, I hear you saying this, I think you mean this, but here's the actual impact of that, then you are also, as the instructor, educating the person who spoke in a way that ideally feels safe enough for them to speak again and maybe put their foot in their mouth again. But we actually, as humans, learn better when emotional learning is in place. If we're just intellectualizing and sort of disconnected neck up, we aren't actually going to remember it as well. So it's okay if people feel strong emotions in these dialogues, they're actually going to learn more. I also want to draw attention to the distinction between shaming someone and holding someone accountable, leading to feeling shame. So you as the instructor holding folks accountable and white folks or non-Latin folks accountable, and they might experience shame because of that. You are not shaming them. You are holding them accountable and they might experience shame. That's not the same thing. So I want to make that clear here as well. I'm going to move on to Maureen Walker's steps. She has 9 steps towards it's interesting. So she talks about something called good conflict, which I'm going to talk about on that slide in which it comes up. But she's talking about using racial dialogue and actually conflict for growth. So she says the path to relational healing invites us to enter into conflict with faith in our human possibilities and with desire for the emergence of something new. Good conflict happens when both parties are able to get their needs represented in the conflict. You can think about this even in terms of your interpersonal conflicts at home. So are you both able to walk away knowing that your needs were heard by the other person? Well, then you're both growing, and actually it's leading to more connection instead of disconnection. Also, Maureen Walker is a relational cultural therapist, and Jean Baker Miller, who began that theory, talks about this idea that if you're not both growing, then neither is growing. And so conflict can lead to both ideally growing, especially if you're coming in with a hope for something new. So these 9 rules, I would say, are primarily for people of color, and I think everyone else and all of us can learn very much from them. So this idea of racial narratives, let me start there. So we all have these racialized narratives in our head. They are, in some ways, you could think of them almost as like young archetypes. We've been raised with them since the womb. They're very much informed by controlling images, which is another word for sort of stereotypes. So we have these stereotypes that inform racial narratives, these ideas about what is possible based on what culture has taught us about a given race, ethnicity, or so forth, or given marginalized group. So when we're in a conflict, let's say it's a good conflict, ideally, one where both people are open to learning, and there's a bit of a disconnect based on race. First, number one, Walker would suggest paying attention to your body. So sort of like pausing and breathing and remembering and realizing that there is room for growth and expansion of the racial narratives that are currently limiting how you're seeing the dynamic. Become curious about the multiple racial narratives in your head. You don't have to believe or act on them. And so this is the piece of sort of identifying. So quickly, like noticing, okay, I'm feeling this thing because of my racial narratives, but just identifying, then you can be like, okay, but I'm not gonna run with that. That's my first thought because of how I've been conditioned, but I'm gonna sort of keep that at the door and move with more openness. If you find yourself becoming highly reactive in a racialized encounter, ask yourself if some deep background story from your own life is being triggered. And so is racial trauma being triggered? Is an experience being brought up? Obviously, in a lot of cases with trauma, it's going to lead to your body sort of reacting either in sort of a fight or flight position or in more of a freeze position. So it's hyperactivating or hypoactivating, coming out of the window of tolerance. If you're coming out of the window of tolerance, you're also not in a position to learn. You're in a position of survival. And so if that's the case, then that would suggest it's really not a good conflict and one where you might want to remove yourself because your body is reacting in a way of survival. You're not going to be learning. It can't be good conflict. Not both parties are going to grow. That might be a time to walk away. So you might also decide to come back at a different point and talk with that person again. Acknowledging the necessity of good conflict, you then can give yourself permission to set the terms of the interaction. So related to what I just said, you might decide, no, I'm not going to meet with you right now about this. Let's set another time to talk about this. You don't need to follow the terms of interaction that have been set by the other person in the dynamic, especially if you're in a position of being in survival mode and person in a marginalized group. Protect yourself first and foremost, and find a time or place or set of terms that work for you. You might also want to recognize when wanting to win is driving the interaction. So is that like sort of like a debate part of you, that maybe you're in a debate team and you think of that as being a piece of it, or maybe it's just a part of the competitiveness of our culture, or maybe it's a part of going to a competitive school, whatever it is, there might be, or being a sports athlete, there might be a part of you that sees the dynamic as something where like, I want to come out on top. That's not coming in with a position of being open to growing and learning, right? So that's not going to help you in terms of good conflict. So learning to recognize that as a piece of it. When an interaction approaches an impasse, so now you've both led to a place where you are feeling all of these things that you don't feel like you can really say. So you're holding these thoughts like, this person is super racist, or this person has said something that was really egregious, or this person is da, 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 whatever it might be. It's not helpful to say that, right? And so what you can say instead is one true thing, and that's something that relational cultural therapists talk about. One true thing can also be thought of as sort of one authentic thing, where I might say instead, I can see you really care about this. That's something I feel strongly. I truly believe that is a truth. It's not what I want to say. I have all these other things that my amygdala wants me to say out of reactivity, but it might be something that somebody can hear. And so it might move the conversation along. So, right, like I say, I can tell you really care about this. The other person then has room to be like, right, I do care about this. And here's why, or, so it might move the conversation. Questioning norms. Notice what might surprise you about that. So what are some of the norms in this dynamic? What do you typically see when, for example, a professor and a student are having a conflict? Typically, you'll see that the student will sort of like back off and leave, or maybe the professor will find that they don't want to be poorly evaluated, so they'll sort of like appease. What are the norms of this dynamic, and what surprises you about that? And then be willing to learn. As I mentioned, that's a really key piece in general for good conflict. You in the power position, even if you do know a lot more about the content that you're talking about, there's still room to learn from the other person, and that's really key. And then lastly, knowing when to walk away. And that could be a safety issue, right? Like some of it's distinguishing between discomfort versus safety. If it's a safety issue, that might mean removing yourself. I also mentioned up here too, I think that's a great point too, knowing to walk away because you're in a hyper or hypoactivated state. If you're in a trauma reaction and having sort of an intense amount of reactivity, then that's not going to be helpful for either of you. And you might say things you regret, or you actually can't learn anyway. And so that might be a time to walk away, but then both agree on coming back to discuss it again at a later point. I want to mention Walker also uses examples in her book, cited here. She also uses examples that happen like out in the world. So like at Starbucks. So in that case, you wouldn't necessarily say like, let's meet up again if you're both in line to get a coffee. So maybe you're not necessarily going to do that, but it's still important just to walk away because it's not going to be a good conflict. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're also going to talk about microintervention. So let's think about, we're in a racial dialogue and somebody says something that's microaggressive. So first we're going to say, what if we perpetrate a microaggression in a racial dialogue? So we're in the racial dialogue, and people of all races, all genders, et cetera, have the potential to do this. So we perpetrate a microaggression. Someone says, hey, I experienced that as a microaggression, or I felt like that was pulling on this stereotype that's not true, blah, blah, blah. First, number one, understanding the distinction between intent versus impact. You might very well intend to have been saying, like, so let's imagine a stereotype. Let's just use an example of saying, wow, you sound so eloquent, to a person of color as a white person. Wow, you're so eloquent. You might be intending that as a compliment, but you're also inherently saying that's surprising. It's surprising that that person is eloquent. And so that suggests that you think that people of color aren't eloquent typically. And so that, even though your intent might have been a compliment, the impact might very well be a very strong racial bias against this group that this person belongs to. So this person then says to you, are you implying that people of color are not typically eloquent? You want to take responsibility for the impact, even if that wasn't your intent. So just saying like, no, I wasn't saying, I don't think that, that's not what I'm saying, I don't feel that way, that's not helpful, right? That's sort of more of a defensive position. Instead, sort of taking responsibility for the impact, like, wow, I can hear how that landed, and although of course it wasn't my intent, I really appreciate you bringing up the impact of it. I've learned from this, I want to keep reflecting on it. that you can see in that example, I've also let down my defenses. So it isn't about how I feel, but rather it's about discussing the impact that I've had on the other person. I have to put aside my white fragility and sort of stay in the space and understand that I've had that impact on someone else. You can see where this is a key part of knowing your marginalized versus privileged identities, because that means me as a white person knows that if I'm in a dynamic with a person of color and something like this happens, I immediately know it's actually quite likely that my racial biases did come up. And so I'm more able to just sort of like whoop, bring down the defenses and recognize that that very much could be the case. For groups that I'm also in a marginalized group, I'm more likely to already know what those microaggressions look like. So as a queer person, I'm pretty aware of what a lot of those microaggressions against queer people are. So if I perpetrate one, I'm much more likely to identify it myself. I'm also less likely to do it, but it can happen. So in that case, I'm also aware, because I know what those microaggressions look like. I'm also aware of it, to be able to be like, okay, right, I'm so sorry, you're right. I can't, wow, my internalized implicit bias got away from me there. And then apologizing and moving forward. And moving forward doesn't mean moving on. It means moving forward, I'm going to take this learning and continue to apply it and continue to educate myself more. I want to be thoughtful about how my words have an impact on people around me. And so I'm going to start by actually trying to learn with other white co-conspirators about that. If we're just talking about race for a second, I'm going to try to first collaborate with those who are like-minded to try to challenge ourselves so that I'm not putting the burden on my folks of color that with whom I work or play or any of it. So I first would work with folks who would be able to say like, right, let's think about how our whiteness is showing up in our implicit biases. And then over time also, I might be able to have at least less of a negative impact on people of color around me to then also be able to invite them to let me know too, without putting the burden on them, because I'm doing my own work first and foremost, including with other white allies. So educating. Then let's think about, what if we witness a microaggression in a racial dialogue? So bystander effect, right? Like pretty common, people won't say anything, which is a bummer because we really need to be saying something. If we're not, it's that sort of silence is violence, silence leads to upholding oppression piece. So we really, if we see something, say something is super, super key. What can we say though? How do we say something without sort of alienating ourselves? Or let's say it's a person in power who microaggressed. How do we do something without it leading to negative evaluation of ourselves? One thing is to make the invisible visible. So that might be challenging the stereotype. So let's go with the example I gave before. Then if somebody said, wow, you're so eloquent, I'm a bystander of that. I might say, are you saying that folks of color are not eloquent? That's a stereotype. Is that what you're sort of pulling on? Or, and sort of challenging it. You might even just ask rather than challenging it or naming the stereotype. You might say, what did you mean by that? Or why were you surprised? Or, so just sort of poking with curiosity at the content. You might disarm it by saying, I disagree with that. I don't think that that's a surprise. You might state values and set limits. And again, that's really stating your own values and limits. So not saying, I think that could have hurt the person of color in the room. You're saying that hurt me. I don't like that. I don't find those kinds of stereotypes helpful. And I find that it upholds the marginalization from which it came. So setting limits, saying, I don't want that around me, right? We can't really tell people they can't have those stereotypes in their whole lives, but they can't do it in front of you. You can set that limit. Educating the offender. So you might say, I think I can hear that you're sort of feeling like that definitely wasn't what you meant, but can I just share also that that's intent, but you might have still had an impact. So whether or not you meant for that to be what the other person felt, that person felt that way. And so it still matters. You might also appeal to that person's values and principles and sort of say, I think you seem like somebody who really cares about racial justice. And this is one of those moments where you might want to just take a beat, reflect on what happened there, and maybe think more about how your implicit biases might very well have come up in that circumstance. You might also, if, for example, you can't reach the person who's the offender, especially if they're in a person in power, that might happen where you feel like that's really not safe to do. You could report the act. You could also seek therapy and counseling for your own activation associated with it. Ideally, though, especially if you're a person of color, prior to that, someone else in an ally position will have already stepped in. Okay, so we're moving from, that's racial dialogue, that's group setting. So that's like we're in a classroom, or we're in a group discussion at a conference, or you're in a group of friends at a bar, or sort of group setting piece. This is now we're thinking about the context of a presentation. So this right here, right now, and other presentations. The symposium, the Student Success Symposium is another one where we talk about this content with every presenter who presents. So this first slide, therefore, will be a reminder to those who have done the training with me and my peers here at the Student Success Symposium. I use Mr. Rogers because he's a bit of a gold standard for tone. He just keeps it rural central here, like very in the middle, calm, a sort of benign matter of factness that I think we all could benefit from in terms of being able to intervene. If I come in with sort of hot, if I come in hot or like activated, it can activate other people who also really might be trying to co-regulate with me. So they're activating to try to then be able to, we work together to come down. But it might also mean that it discredits what I'm saying. And so the idea is sort of being able to sort of use benign matter of factness as a way of solidly noting that this was an issue or that you saw microaggression. The tone relates both to your paralanguage, so like how my tone of voice is, but also the tone of the content. So what language are you using? I talk a lot with my colleague Dean Hammer about sort of the militarization of our language. So like taking a stab at it, right? Like that's a militarized sort of like aggressive phrase, and yet it's one we use plenty. So this idea of thinking about even the language you use, not just the content that the language represents, but even the language can be an important piece to think about. When you're going to be presenting, how about also, instead of repairing when there's unintentional harm, thinking ahead of time? So like taking the time to really assess your presentation for what it looks like. Who's coming right before you and how does that prime the audience in a specific way? With whom are you speaking? So who's present? Was that your intended audience, or who is the actual audience, if not? With Student Success Symposium, we might see folks who are really trying to just speak to other faculty members when in fact there might be staff and students present as well. So we'd be inviting those folks to really think about how is this content going to land with also students and staff when it seems pretty primarily geared towards faculty. The same thing might be true about race. And so is this geared towards folks of color or white folks? And what happens if it's more of a diverse audience? You heard me refer to this a couple times in the beginning when I was framing the presentation, that there are pieces that are me calling in my white peers and non-Latin peers, but there are also pieces that are for all of us. And even the pieces that are me calling in my white peers are helpful for all of us in other ways. So that was me attending to who the audience is. What types of content do you include in each portion of your presentation? So just what is the content? What content, though, is likely to crop up in the activities? Okay, so say then I'm like, all right, everyone go into breakout rooms. Here's some discussion questions. How are those going to come up in the context of those groups? And what will that look like? What do you think people might bring up? Because even though you intend, let's say you're really like, like I was going to say inundated. Is that the word I mean? Immersed, let's say immersed. You're immersed in a group of folks who are anti-racist. And so you're thinking, okay, when I ask this question, it's going to look like this when they discuss it. But not everybody who shows up at your presentation is necessarily going to be immersed in anti-racist language. So you really need to think about what that means about what your questions will raise for folks who come who might not be anti-racist. And so if that's coming up in the context of other people of color in that small group, how's that going to feel for those people of color in the room? So thinking about how certain interaction may bring up certain content. Same thing is true with interaction throughout the presentation. So not just during the activities, but when I'm sort of encouraging people to speak up or either speak up or put things in the chat, what will that elicit? And then where might your own biases show up in the content as well? So those are some questions to consider as you design your thing. This is Pia Alexander, who brought this content to us for our Student Success Symposium. This is the last slide that's sort of from that content. So for those of you who have had that training, this is the last of it. The rest of it is new. So,
we do have one question in the chat. Would now be a good time for me to read it to you?
I love it. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, from Reese. What strategies or thoughts do you have about the inherent tension in suggesting tone moderating with issues of tone policing?
Yeah, really, really, really great point. Yeah, absolutely. So where I don't mean this is somebody who's feeling activated as the victim of a microaggression and sort of thinking or feeling activated. If you're thinking and feeling activated, I don't think that you should be attending to tone. Don't worry about it. Like express yourself and be heard. And ideally, sort of allies or co-conspirators in the room can jump in and help in a way that also backs you up so that you're not then the target of the person in power using tone policing. that's the ideal place. Obviously, sometimes that may happen, and that's effed up, right? Like that's where we then also go above that person and find out what we can do to work with that, because you having an activated tone is totally understandable and should be absolutely welcomed. So if we go back to thinking about the racial dialogue piece, when I was talking about emotion, there's activation and emotion in racial dialogue that is actually should be welcomed by the person who's instructing. So the person who's instructing should not be tone policing or emotion policing, and in fact should be encouraging it. If there's activation to the level of a trauma response, maybe that for that person individually who has that trauma response, they may decide to remove themselves out of safety, but that shouldn't be up to the instructor to say you're too activated or your tone is out of line or any of that. That's really one of the absolutely do not do's for racial dialogue or running racial dialogue. When I'm talking about tone in this context, I'm talking about people who are presenting. And so me presenting in this conference right now, I am activated because I'm nervous, to be fair. But I'm also thinking about if I sort of am in an activated state and I'm, sort of leading to my audience also feeling an activation, then my content isn't going to land the same way. And so I'm thinking about when I'm presenting using that sort of benign matter of factness rather than, for example, getting angry at my white peers for things that I do too, right? Or whatever it might be. So I'm thinking about using my tone as a presenter in a way that allows for my content to get through. So this is not in racial dialogue. This is in presentations for the person in power presenting. Does that help, Reese? Should I go my chat? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, John, you spoke to it as well. Exactly. I'm talking for those in as the presenters managing our tone so as not to activate other folks. Granted, there are times where I might feel activated, especially if I'm a person of color presenting. I think that's totally legitimate. I really do. I think that using your tone however it feels natural to you is absolutely doing your thing. I'm feeling your full self, bringing your full authentic self into the presentation. There might be times where my tone is going to fall off, my sort of ideal place of window of tolerance because of activation. And it really isn't to shame that in any way. It's much more about how do we work with being the person in power, presenting in a way that then people can sort of hear and understand the content. Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Pepe. So this idea that racial language is used many times, they say, well, that's what the media uses. An example is using the word illegals when referring to undocumented individuals. Absolutely. Really not okay. And that's a big part of why a certain president we had recently was a real big problem in terms of language, because he was using language also that was very much inappropriate. And then people could say, well, the president says it. Right. So that's why that's so dangerous. And there are plenty of people who were supporters of the president that were like, well, just because he says it, whatever, who cares? It's like, well, I care because that's also making it more okay to use for everybody else. The same thing we said about CNN, right? And so this idea that like even amongst liberal groups that think that they're so aware of this kind of content, or then like repeating things used on CNN. CNN is not perfect. There's so many times I've seen wild racist shit come across on CNN. Wild. So it absolutely doesn't mean just because you're seeing it in the media or just because it's liberal media that means it's safe to use that language. Absolutely not. Keep learning and educating yourself to sort of find out what that language is that's appropriate. Should I keep doing that? Yeah. Actively trying to get pejorative language into media in order to influence the discourse in particular directions and protect particular biased viewpoints. Exactly. Okay. So I'm a person in power presenting, and someone notes that I've caused unintentional harm. So say someone speaks up, and honestly, potentially me bringing up the tone piece could have enacted some unintentional harm in terms of folks feeling like I was sort of recommending tone policing. And so then Reese coming forward and sort of saying, hold on, what did you mean about this distinction, was a great chance for me to sort of slow down and think about how what I was saying might have had that unintentional impact. And so first you would sort of consider the feedback and consciously reframe. So that was where I sort of said, okay, yeah, absolutely, great point. And in fact, here's where I'm going with it in terms of this, but in terms of racial dialogue, not okay. and then adapting the rest of your presentation or the rest of your comment or whatever it is to include that or be inclusive of that feedback. So where conscious reframing is awareness in the moment and skillful reframing of unintentionally disrespectful, discredited comments, you would then also then share appreciation. So you would also express gratitude, thank you so much, and then see it really honestly as a gift, as I do. So thank you, Reese. So accepting feedback non-defensively, just in general, these are sort of the like overall concepts. In order to do that, you really need to just do your own work first. So we need to go home, do our own work in terms of self-reflective work to understand that we do have implicit biases. It is in the air, it's in the water if we're fish, as conditioned by society that are particularly invisible to us when we belong to the dominant group. So if you think your implicit biases are gone, think again. Really, those of us in co-conspiratorship, ideally roles, are constantly doing that. I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life in terms of challenging them and thinking about where my implicit biases show up. That's a fact. Remember that feedback is a gift. So that was an act of courage of Reese, and also it's a gift because it's built on the hope that I could receive it and then change how I was talking about it. And so then I was able to make that distinction and share with you all how those two things are different between racial dialogue and presentation in terms of tone. And so really it's a gift. If you can remember that when people give you feedback, it really helps you not get as activated by it. If we're able to take time to reflect on what's been shared, do so before responding. So a large part of my role as the director of the DSJ on the New England campus is to consult with faculty, largely white, about times when they have either microaggressed or had implicit bias sort of show up in how they've taught a certain thing. And so then they might call me to ask about what to do. Oftentimes I see folks who like really want to actively respond right away. And so like they've gotten an email that says a certain amount of content in terms of the implicit bias, and the professor's instinct is to like write right back. I often challenge them to just take a beat and take some time to, first of all, reflect on what that person has shared. And then you can also say that in the response email that, thank you, I've taken a couple hours prior to responding to really let this sit with me and to think about what you're meaning here and to challenge my implicit biases. So it's okay to take some time to reflect on what's been shared. In fact, I think it shows additional respect for the person who's shared the content to begin with. And then commit to challenging our implicit biases on an ongoing basis. This is a lifelong journey for us all. So not only are you going to say that to somebody and when they share with you that you might have had an implicit bias that showed up, you're also then going to actually do that and continue challenging it. We can't truly know if our implicit biases were involved, so welcome the possibility that they were. So if someone raises that they think you might have had implicit bias associated with a certain comment, rather than assuming or hoping that it wasn't true, we can't really know that. So welcoming the possibility, no matter what, is an important position for those in the power position. The fact that people of color and marginalized group need to even take the time and effort to just wonder if what we said was motivated by implicit biases is itself a form of oppression, let alone taking the effort to share it with us. So let us then, as the person in power, take that effort on. Just the fact that you have to wonder for a second, did that person say that thing as motivated by racism or implicit bias? That is additional effort unfairly put on you by our white supremacy. And so if that person of color who's experienced that weight and effort of wondering, then comes to you and you say, what do you mean? That's not what I meant. I wasn't saying that. Then you're then denying that all of this effort and then that leaves that person continuing to wonder, right? Like then that person has to keep holding that effort and burden. And so instead saying, wow, thank you for sharing that. I wonder if you're right. I imagine you probably are. That's really helpful to think about. You're taking then that wondering out of their hands so that ideally it will reduce the burden. So in the moment when somebody provides feedback, yeah, absolutely. Very draining to be on the defensive most of the time, especially in academia, having to constantly justify or explain things. Absolutely. And exactly, for people of color and those in marginalized group, constantly having to explain why you think a thing is a microaggression or just wonder before you even get to the point of explaining. And so, of course, it's extremely draining. There's this book about racial fatigue that I really like. It's around this idea of sort of like just the fatigue of being in a marginalized racial group. But then also it spans all the way to things like racial trauma that occur from that constant chronic stress and fatigue that comes with wondering and explaining. So in the moment, I've received feedback. take a deep breath, sort of lower your defensiveness a little bit to do that. And then you challenge your immediate reactions and automatic thoughts. So, okay, what is the first thing that's going to come to mind for me as a white person? Probably defensiveness, right? If it's a racialized example. So our immediate reaction, we're going to challenge that. We're going to say, okay, my first thought is this, take a beat, don't have to act on it. That's sort of what Walker's saying as well. And then accept the feedback and appreciate it. I'm saying, thank you, I accept this. And I'll give you some quotes on the following slide. So I would also say, and I want to just again say, this is for people in power who have been brought feedback. Okay. So I think in the case of somebody, a person of color who has been brought feedback that is racist feedback, this is not what I'm talking about at all. Okay. So I really challenge the white folks in power who are brought feedback about their implicit biases coming in to take a deep breath, challenge your first thought that might be defensive, and then accept and appreciate the feedback. Even if you feel you've already accepted the feedback. So say my first reaction was, as a person in power presenting, I said to the person who brought feedback, I said, oh, wow, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm going to really sit with that, take that with me, and keep reflecting on it. I'm not then going to also give an explanation. I'm not going to be like, but what I really meant was this, right? Like that's undoing any work you did. It's still bringing in defensiveness prior, like following what you're trying to accept or appreciate. And then the other thing is quickly changing the subject. So in presentations, you kind of have to keep going. You kind of have to change the subject after you've accepted and appreciated, but you might take a beat. If you are on email with somebody who has shared something like this with you, don't put other stuff in the email. Just stay on topic with the implicit bias, apologize, accept, appreciate. The other topic can be brought up later in a different setting. So it really shows that you're really trying to just focus on that content of the feedback that you were given as a person in power, like a professor or presenter. Whereas quickly changing the subject, even in an email context, is sort of a way of like taking the power back. So I've accepted, I've appreciated the implicit bias. And then in the second paragraph, I say, well, don't forget to have this on Monday, right? Like that's a way of sort of like reasserting my power as the professor. Unnecessary, also harmful and defensive. I'm going to take a beat and look at the chat. Nice. Thanks, Reese. Racial battle fatigue in higher education. No, but that's great. Thank you so much. And what is Cynthia's here, right? We talked about racial fatigue. I can find that too. I could probably find it right now, honestly. I have it too. It's just not in it's in my office at work. But look. Right, should I be doing this right now? Oh, it's called Black fatigue. That's why. So that's why I messed with y'all about that. It's called Black fatigue, not racial fatigue. It's How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit by Mary Frances Winters. And I see racial battle fatigue, so that's great. Thank you, Reese. I'll look into that more. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have to write that. Do I write it? I'll just write it. Let me get also Mary Frances Winters. That's what I said, right? Mary Frances.
I put the link in.
Oh, I love it. Thank you, Jamie. Amazing. Okay. Fabulous. So this idea that fatigue alone is something folks of marginalized groups face, and then that can span even into chronic stress, which can then become racial trauma. That makes me really happy. Sweet kids. Okay, so what are some quotes or very direct things you can talk about? Yeah, absolutely. Pia, thank you. Dr. Ken Hardy is phenomenal. I really, really love Hardy's work. And there's some great videos of Hardy giving lectures that I recommend bringing into your classes if you're talking about racial fatigue or racial trauma. And certainly the Racial Trauma Clinical Strategies for Healing Invisible Wounds is a really great book. And he also has some great articles that informs that book. I recommend strongly. Thank you, Pia. So these sort of quotes are to take place after the I'm deeply sorry I've harmed you. So you are also apologizing. But some other ways to accept it non-defensively are to say, thank you for sharing this feedback. I'm committed to taking the time to reflect on and learn from it. You might, and ideally you would, take it a step further, in my opinion, saying thank you for sharing about the impact I had on you. So again, this is after saying I'm deeply sorry I've harmed you. And thank you for sharing about the impact I had on you. Regardless of my intent, the impact was harmful. And I plan to continue challenging my implicit biases and looking for how they show up in different spaces. I hope to take time on my own and with, whether that's white, non-Latinx, those in the dominant group, or no, not those in the dominant group who might be white or non-Latinx. I plan to take time with them, those peers, to reflect on how my implicit biases showed up in this encounter so as not to put the burden on you to further explain how it affected you. However, if there's anything else you want me to know, please know I'm listening. I recognize I'm on a lifelong journey of identifying and challenging my implicit biases, made particularly invisible to me due to my status as a member of the dominant group. While I wish I had never harmed you in the first place, I am grateful for this opportunity for continued growth. So some things you might say here in the 5 minutes. Fuck. Oh my God. I'm so sorry for. Oh wow. Oh, look at this. We're on thought exercise. We're done. We did it.
Great. I was just going to say also, we've got the presenters running late for the next session. So we've got a couple of minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Ingrid. That's wonderful. Sorry, I swore, friends. Okay. So going back up here though, then I'll just finish this out since we have a couple minutes. Cynthia, thank you so much for that heads up though, because I honestly, I had no clue. I thought we were way earlier than that. So some quotes you could use. You could also obviously take this into, ideally, you'll have your own language that you use for this and sort of use your experience, your practice with other people, your learning from folks of color who have given you the gift of sharing suggestions. You would use your own sort of experience to come up with how you might respond to this kind of feedback. Okay. So with that, I have also a closing meditation. So first, I'm just going to share with you the thought exercise for you all to take with you and sort of think about. Again, this is both for folks of color and my fellow non-folks of color, white co-conspirators. Have you seen someone successfully intervene around a microaggression in a racial dialogue or group context? What worked about the micro-intervention? So when have you seen that go successfully? And if not, has there been a time when you wish someone or you had intervened? And what do you wish they or you had said? Then sort of that's the racial dialogue first chunk of the thing. Second chunk of the presentation was around presentation. So have you witnessed unintentional harm perpetrated in the context of a conference or presentation? How was it addressed? And how would you have addressed it differently if you would have? So those are some thoughts for you to take with you, and I'll end on this closing meditation here. So this is a poem you all have seen, I'm sure, by Marianne Williamson, but has been edited by Maureen Walker in 2001 in the reference in my references. So our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we're powerful beyond measure. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened or relational about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure. Shrinking is a strategy of disconnection. As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. So intended to leave us on a note of thinking about the ways in which we can bring our full authentic selves into connection and use that connection to fight the disempowerment, disconnection, marginalization perpetrated by white supremacist, patriarchal, exceptionalist society. And okay, fabulous. I don't have any questions, so I'm going to end with that. Here are my references as well. So thank you all so much. I will put also my email in the chat for anybody that would like to follow up with me. I guess you can find it. Oh yeah, you have my whatever. Anyway, here's my email in case anyone wants to share.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful way to close the presentation. I can stay here with you and talk for hours. We know we can do that for sure. Thank you for that meditation. It's really, really, really good tone for this day and for everything that we are doing here. And we hope that we can take it with us as we continue the process. Thank you. That's that's all I can say. Thank you. And my apologies for being a little 2 minutes late. And I swear in the previous presentation, because everything went blank in my computer, so I couldn't see anything.
No, that's awful, Cynthia.
I have no idea what happened there. I still don't know. So hopefully it won't happen again throughout the day. We are like kind of finger crossed.
Not the day for that. Not the day, computer.
Exactly. It's like, what just happened? But thank you so much for being here. Everything, and thank you for everything you do. I think it's very important for all our participants to know that we intentionally include this topic every time, every year. We want a white voice to be here. Well, maybe not just one, but at least one to be able to actually talk to us and have that side of the story and how it is that we can connect and we can interact and really bring up the voices of advocacy and social justice and anti-racism, and how do we do this together. So it's very, very intentional, and we choose, I have to say, I really, really try to choose people that are of all my trust to do this, to be part of these events. So it's a very, very important for me to know that I consider Kate, Dr. Evans, an amazing ally and really, really co-conspirator, and really, really part of a person that I trust personally and professionally. So I really want to have that seal of approval, if I may, if that's okay. But I do want to say that is very intentional, very purposeful, and that she and then the other people that have come before her in this space have proven to do the work more than just talk the talk. So I really hope that you take that with your heart and know that it is a person that you can reach out as well. So thank you.